My life took a dramatic and heartbreaking turn when my mother decided to prioritize her new family over me, her firstborn. It all started when I was just 16 years old, a vulnerable teenager trying to navigate the complexities of life. My mother had given birth to me when she was only 20, and my biological father had abandoned us before I was even born. She had raised me alone for years, with the unwavering support of my grandparents, who helped her finish her education and secure a stable job. I always admired her strength, but little did I know that her priorities would shift so drastically. When I was about 8 years old, my mother started dating Harry, a co-worker. They got married after a few years, and though Harry and I weren't particularly close, we managed to coexist peacefully. For a while, it seemed like our family was stable, even happy. But everything changed when my mother became pregnant with twins for years into their marriage. At first, I was overjoyed at the idea of having siblings, but I soon realized that my presence in the house was becoming an inconvenience. As my mother's pregnancy progressed, I noticed her growing distant. She seemed irritated by my mere existence, and I tried my best to stay out of her way, hoping it was just a phase. But 6 months after the twins were born, my worst fears were confirmed. My mother and Harry sat me down for what they called a serious conversation. They told me, in no uncertain terms, that they could no longer keep me in the house. Their reasoning: they needed to focus on the twins and couldn't afford to support a big family on their modest income. I was devastated. I pleaded with them, offering to get a job to help with expenses, but my mother coldly shut me down. She said she wanted to save money and resources for the children who deserved it more. Her words cut deeper than any knife. It was clear that I was no longer wanted, no longer part of the family. I felt like a burden, an afterthought in the life of the woman who had once been my everything. The emotional toll was unbearable. I was just a teenager, barely old enough to understand the world, let alone survive in it on my own. But I had no choice. With a heavy heart, I packed my belongings and left the only home I had ever known. I went straight to my grandparents' house, where I was welcomed with open arms, but the pain of being cast aside by my own mother lingered like a dark cloud over my life. Looking back, I realize how cruel and calculated their decision was. They didn't legally evict me. They knew they couldn't, but they manipulated me into leaving, preying on my sense of dignity and self-worth. It was a betrayal that scarred me deeply, and it marked the beginning of a long, painful journey toward independence and self-discovery. Little did I know, this was just the first of many challenges I would face, as I struggled to find my place in a world that had already shown me how harsh it could be. After being cast out of my mother's home at the tender age of 16, I was thrust into a world of uncertainty and hardship. The emotional scars of being told I was no longer wanted ran deep, but I knew I had to push forward if I wanted to survive. My grandparents, though loving and supportive, were elderly and couldn't financially support me indefinitely. I had no choice but to grow up fast and take control of my own destiny. The first step was finding a part-time job. At 16, I juggled school and work, often sacrificing sleep and social life just to make ends meet. It was exhausting, but I refused to let my mother's rejection define me. Every shift I worked, every dollar I earned, felt like a small victory against the odds stacked against me. My grandparents provided a roof over my head, but I knew I couldn't rely on them forever. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but it also fueled my determination to prove that I could succeed on my own. When it came time for college, I faced another uphill battle. My mother and Harry had made it clear that they wouldn't support me financially, as they were saving for the twins' future. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that my own mother had chosen to prioritize her new family over me once again. But I refused to let their indifference stop me. With the help of my uncle, who graciously co-signed my student loan, I was able to enroll in college. It wasn't an easy decision. I knew the debt would follow me for years, but I was determined to create a better future for myself. College life was a whirlwind of challenges. I worked multiple jobs to cover my tuition, rent, and living expenses, all while keeping up with my studies. There were nights when I barely slept, days when I survived on instant noodles, and moments when I questioned whether I could keep going. But I reminded myself of everything I had already overcome. I couldn't afford to fail not after everything I had been through. My mother's rejection had lit a fire within me, and I was determined to rise above the circumstances she had forced me into. Graduation day was bittersweet. While I was proud of my accomplishments, the absence of my mother was a painful reminder of the family I had lost. Only my grandparents were there to celebrate with me, and though their love meant the world, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. My mother hadn't even bothered to congratulate me, let alone acknowledge my achievement. It was a harsh reality, but it also solidified my resolve to keep moving forward. After graduation, I entered the workforce with the same grit and determination that had carried me through college. The early years were toughy, didn't make much money, and the weight of my student loans loomed over me. But I was relentless. I worked long hours, took on extra projects, and constantly sought opportunities to prove myself. Slowly but surely, I began to climb the corporate ladder. Each promotion felt like a triumph, a testament to my resilience and hard work. Now, at 33, I hold a senior management position at the same company where I started my career. It's a role I've earned through sheer perseverance, and I'm proud of how far I've come. But my success didn't come without sacrifice. The years of struggle, the sleepless nights, and the emotional toll of being cast aside by my own mother have shaped me into the person I am today. I've learned to rely on myself, to turn adversity into strength, and to never let anyone else dictate my worth. Looking back, I realize that my mother's decision to kick me out was the catalyst for my independence. While it was a painful and traumatic experience, it forced me to grow up faster than most and taught me the value of self. I've built a life for myself, one that I can be proud of, and no one, not even my mother, can take that away from me. Just when I thought I had finally moved on from the painful chapter of my life, where my mother had cast me aside, she reappeared, bringing with her a storm of emotions and demands that I never saw coming. It had been years since we last spoke, years of silence, of healing, and of building a life for myself without her. But one day, out of the blue, she showed up at my doorstep with Harry, her husband, and a request that left me stunned and furious. The moment I opened the door, I could tell something was off. My mother's face was a mix of desperation and false warmth, a stark contrast to the cold indifference she had shown me all those years ago. Harry stood awkwardly behind her, avoiding eye contact. They didn't even bother with pleasantries. Instead, they launched into a rehearsed speech about how they had heard from my uncle about my recent promotion and how well I was doing in my career. At first, I thought they had come to congratulate me, to finally acknowledge my success. But I was wrong, dead wrong. Their true intentions became clear within minutes. My mother, with a tone that was almost pleading, explained that they were in financial trouble. Their business had failed, and they were struggling to make ends meet. The twins, now nearing college age, needed tuition money, and they had come to me for help. It was as if they expected me to open my wallet without hesitation, as if the past didn't matter. The audacity of it all left me speechless. But what truly infuriated me was the way they framed their request. They didn't ask, they demanded. My mother even had the nerve to say that this was my chance to make it up to her for all the years she had raised me alone. She claimed that I owed her for the sacrifices she had made, completely ignoring the fact that she had abandoned me when I needed her most. Harry chimed in, trying to soften the blow by saying that paying for the twins' education would be a way to support the family. The irony was almost laughable. Where was this sense of family when they kicked me out at 16? I couldn't hold back my anger. I reminded them of the years I had spent working multiple jobs to put myself through college, of the student loans I was still paying off because they had refused to help me. I threw their own words back at them, recalling how they had told me they needed to save money for the children who deserved it more. The bitterness in my voice was palpable, but I didn't care. They had no right to come into my life now, after years of silence, and expect me to bail them out. My mother tried to guilt-trip me, saying I should have been mature enough to understand their decision to prioritize the twins over me. She even accused me of being selfish for cutting them out of my life. But I stood my ground. I told them point-blank that I wouldn't give them a single cent. They had made their choice years ago, and now they had to live with the consequences. I had worked too hard to get where I was, and I wasn't about to let them take advantage of me. The confrontation ended with me asking them to leave. My mother's face twisted with anger as she hurled accusations at me, calling me ungrateful and heartless. But I didn't care. I had spent years rebuilding my life after they shattered it, and I wasn't about to let them drag me back into their mess. As they walked away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I had stood up for myself, and sadness that my mother still couldn't see how much she had hurt me. That day marked a turning point. It solidified my resolve to keep my distance from them, no matter what. I had worked too hard to let their toxicity back into my life. And as I closed the door behind them, I knew one thing for certain. I didn't owe them anything. Not my money, not my time, and certainly not my forgiveness. The confrontation with my mother and Harry at my doorstep was only the beginning of a series of escalating conflicts that pushed our already fractured relationship to the brink of collapse. After I refused to give them money for the twins' college tuition, I thought they would finally leave me alone. But I underestimated my mother's determination, or perhaps her desperation. What followed was a relentless campaign of guilt-tripping, manipulation, and outright harassment that tested my patience and resolve in ways I never imagined. It started with emails. A few days after our confrontation, I began receiving lengthy messages from my mother, each one more emotionally charged than the last. She reminded me of all the sacrifices she had made when I was a child, painting herself as the victim and me as the ungrateful daughter who had turned her back on her family. She even went so far as to say that raising me alone had been a burden she had carried out of love, as if I should be eternally indebted to her for doing the bare minimum as a parent. The audacity of her words was staggering, but what hurt the most was the way she twisted the narrative to make herself the hero and me the villain. At first, I tried to ignore her. I blocked her email address, hoping that would be the end of it. But she didn't stop. She created new accounts, each time finding a way to bypass my blocks and flood my inbox with her toxic messages. It was exhausting, like trying to hold back a tidal wave with my bare hands. I finally snapped and replied to one of her emails, laying out everything I had been holding in for years. I told her how her rejection had shattered me, how her decision to prioritize the twins over me had left deep emotional scars, and how I had worked tirelessly to build a life for myself without her help. I thought maybe, just maybe, she would finally understand the pain she had caused. But I was wrong. Her response was even more venomous. She called me selfish, ungrateful, and heartless, accusing me of abandoning her when she needed me most. It was as if she had completely rewritten history, casting herself as the wronged party and me as the villain. Her words cut deep, but they also solidified my resolve to cut her out of my life for good. I blocked her again, vowing not to engage further. But my mother wasn't done. The situation took a terrifying turn when she showed up at my workplace. I wasn't there that Di had taken the day off due to feeling unwell, but the receptionist called to inform me that my mother had arrived, demanding to see me. When they told her I wasn't there, she refused to leave, causing a scene that left the staff visibly uncomfortable. The receptionist eventually put her on the phone with me, and I could hear the anger in her voice as she demanded that I meet her in person. I was furious. I told her in no uncertain terms that if she didn't leave immediately, I would take legal action. I even threatened to sue her for harassment, a move that seemed to finally get through to her. She left, but the damage was done. That incident was the final straw. I realized that my mother was capable of crossing any boundary to get what she wanted, and I couldn't afford to let her disrupt my life any further. I consulted a lawyer to explore my options, determined to protect myself from her relentless pursuit. The emotional toll was immense, but I knew I had to stand my ground. This wasn't just about money or the past. It was about reclaiming my peace and ensuring that my hard-earned success couldn't be tainted by her toxicity. The escalation of our conflict was a painful reminder of how far our relationship had fallen. Once, she had been my mother, the person I looked up to and relied on. Now, she was a stranger, someone who saw me not as her daughter, but as a means to an end. And as much as it hurt, I knew I had to let go of any hope of reconciliation. My mother had made her choices, and now I was making mine. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity. I wasn't the villain in her story. I was the hero of my own, and no amount of guilt or manipulation could take that away from me. The final chapter of this tumultuous saga with my mother reached its climax in a way I never could have anticipated. After years of emotional turmoil, manipulation, and outright harassment, the situation came to a head in a dramatic and unsettling confrontation that forced me to take drastic measures to protect myself. It was the culmination of everything that had been building since the day she kicked me out of her home, and it marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one defined by boundaries, self-preservation, and hard-earned peace. It all came crashing down one evening when I returned home from work, exhausted but relieved to be done with another long day. As I approached my front door, I saw my mother standing there, waiting for me. Her presence alone was enough to send a chill down my spine. I had made it clear that I wanted nothing to do with her, but she had ignored every boundary I had set. This time, however, things were different. She wasn't there to talk or plead. She was there to confront me, and the look in her eyes was one of pure rage. Before I could even react, she lunged at me, screaming obscenities and blaming me for everything that had gone wrong in her life. Her words were a chaotic mix of accusations and curses, each one more venomous than the last. She shoved me to the ground, sending my phone flying out of my hand as I tried to call for help. I was stunned, both by her physical aggression and the sheer intensity of her anger. It was as if years of resentment and frustration had finally boiled over, and I was the target of her unchecked fury. But I wasn't the same vulnerable teenager she had cast aside all those years ago. I was stronger now, both physically and emotionally. I managed to push her off me, using the strength I had built through years of self-reliance and determination. The commotion drew the attention of my neighbors, who rushed to my aid and restrained her until the police arrived. It was a surreal moment, watching my own mother being held back like a stranger, her face twisted with rage and desperation. When the police arrived, I made the difficult decision to press charges. It wasn't something I took lightly, but I knew I had to protect myself. Her behavior had escalated to a dangerous level, and I couldn't risk her showing up at my home or workplace again. I also sought a restraining order, determined to create a legal barrier between us. The process was emotionally draining, but it was necessary. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of control over my own life. In the aftermath, I learned that Harry had taken the twins and moved in with his parents. leaving my mother to deal with the fallout of her actions alone. According to my grandparents, she had become increasingly unstable, lashing out at anyone who tried to reason with her. Even they, who had always tried to maintain a relationship with her for the sake of the twins, had reached their limit. They told me they no longer wanted to be around her, a decision that spoke volumes about how far she had fallen. As for me, I began to focus on rebuilding my life once again. The experience had left me shaken, but it also reinforced my determination to move forward. I started looking for a new home, one that would give me the space and security I needed to heal. My career continued to thrive, and I took pride in knowing that I had achieved success on my own terms, despite the obstacles my mother had thrown in my path. This chapter of my life was a painful reminder of the damage that unresolved anger and resentment can cause. But it also taught me the importance of setting boundaries and prioritizing my own well-being. My mother's actions were a reflection of her own struggles, not my worth. And while I hoped she would eventually find the help she needed, I knew I couldn't be the one to save her. My journey was about moving forward, not looking back. As I closed this chapter, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't known was possible. The scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined me. I had built a life of resilience, strength, and independence, and nothing, not even my mother's chaos, could take that away from me. The road ahead was mine to shape, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace it.